The dense, primordial canopy of this ancient jungle blocks out the sun, casting an eerie emerald twilight.
Thick and humid air hangs heavily over the forest floor, entirely saturated with raw, untamed natural life.
Suddenly, the damp ground begins to tremble beneath the rhythmic and thunderous booming of massive, heavy footsteps. Giant prehistoric birds immediately take sudden flight in panicked flocks, piercing the heavy silence with frantic screeching. Through the parting thick mist steps the absolutely undisputed apex predator of this deeply ancient, overgrown realm.
This magnificent giant primate is a truly massive walking mountain of dense, dark muscle and thick fur.
His incredibly broad, heavy chest is visibly covered in the faded physical scars of countless territorial battles.
Highly intelligent and fiercely observant brown eyes carefully scan the incredibly dense surrounding foliage for hidden threats. Today, this massively built alpha male is not just conducting his regular morning territorial boundary patrol route.
He is currently highly focused on actively tracking a completely formidable and terrifying unknown natural animal nightmare.
A deeply unnatural heavy trench has been violently carved directly into the damp tropical forest dirt floor.
It aggressively winds its highly destructive physical path completely through the lush jungle like a dried riverbed.
Extremely large ancient wooden trees have been brutally snapped like completely fragile twigs and violently pushed aside.
The incredibly massive heavy primate physically kneels down, carefully tracing the sharp edges of crushed green vegetation.
The destroyed trench is entirely coated in a thick, foul slime that slightly sizzles upon touching leaves.
The giant primate silently curls his upper lip, aggressively revealing incredibly sharp, massive teeth designed for combat.
He lets out a deeply low rumbling growl that powerfully vibrates completely through the ancient forest roots.
He is strictly tracking a legendary giant serpent of truly unimaginable physical proportions across this vast territory.
This massive carnivorous reptile has recently slithered completely into his jungle domain, seeking entirely new feeding grounds.
The giant primate immediately confidently follows the massive physical trail of perfectly fresh destruction through the trees.
Servant. As the extremely giant primate steadily travels deeper,
The heavily overgrown, lush green jungle environment eventually cleanly gives way to a vastly sprawling, treacherous swampland.
The surrounding entirely stagnant swamp water is totally black, physically motionless, and thickly covered in suffocating algae.
A completely dense and incredibly heavy natural gray fog slowly rolls directly across the highly murky water.
This extremely thick, creeping,
It directly proves that completely normal local wildlife has either successfully fled or been entirely consumed.
The utterly fearless giant primate firmly steps directly into the incredibly murky and stagnant dark swamp waters.
The highly dark, thick swamp sludge very slowly naturally rises directly upward to his extremely massive waistline. He heavily wades forward entirely slowly, making absolutely sure to keep his massive physical body strictly tensed. The deeply focused giant primate actively watches the totally dark swamp surface for highly unusual, unnatural ripples.
Suddenly, the completely dark and incredibly stagnant murky swamp water violently and aggressively erupts directly behind him.
with the entirely terrifying natural fast hunting speed of a deeply striking wild viper, the serpent attacks.
A truly incredibly colossal giant natural serpent head violently bursts directly upward from the totally black depths.
The deeply massive giant snake perfectly widely opens its incredibly thick and completely heavily muscled dark jaws.
Its wide natural mouth is densely lined with perfectly sharp, totally backwardly curving, deadly, massive animal teeth.
He rapidly violently twists his incredibly massive torso backward,
actively forcefully swinging his heavy fist entirely downward.
However, the incredibly thick, entirely tough, densely packed animal scales heavily, perfectly, totally, firmly deflect the blow. In a highly terrifying, entirely absolute display of incredibly efficient natural physical predatory behavior, the snake moves.
The incredibly massive snake perfectly utilizes momentum to completely launch its endlessly heavy muscular body entirely upward.
The highly massive, thick coils forcefully, completely, tightly, violently wrap around his incredibly broad, heavily muscled chest.
The completely massive, naturally brave, entirely heavy, huge primate totally actively fights.
The highly terrifying, absolutely, completely, deeply severe, perfectly true, deadly natural constriction applies utterly merciless, crushing pressure. Drawing upon incredibly deeply pure, natural, primal physical adrenaline, the heavily trapped primate entirely abruptly stops fighting. He fiercely targets the massive serpent head, deeply lunging forward with absolutely incredible, explosive, raw physical power.
The completely massive heavy ape successfully sinks his incredibly thick teeth directly into the massive giant snake. The deeply surprised and entirely overwhelmed massive giant green snake hisses loudly in completely sudden physical pain.
Taking immediate physical advantage of the sudden bloody distraction, Tom wedges his incredibly massive free hand safely.
With a deeply deafening echoing roar, he physically flexes his entirely massive muscular upper primate body completely.
He aggressively and completely successfully, forcefully pries the incredibly thick, deadly snake coils entirely physically safely open.
The sheer physical, explosive, natural force of the two violently thrashing titans completely overwhelms the muddy ground. The thoroughly structurally unstable muddy swamp earth violently and entirely completely collapses beneath their massive combined weight. A truly massive and incredibly deep geological sinkhole violently and aggressively opens up beneath the dark water.
The two incredibly massive, violently thrashing giant natural titans completely and utterly plummet down into deep darkness.
They heavily and totally successfully crash directly onto a completely colossal dark subterranean stone cavern floor. Exactly.
The completely stale, incredibly cold, and perfectly dusty subterranean cavern air slowly and quietly finally safely settles. An entirely thick and deeply sticky, gray, incredibly heavy, giant arachnid webbing perfectly blankets the huge cavern. A deeply terrifying and highly massive physical swarm of giant armored earth spiders completely suddenly finally emerges. The highly massive, deeply terrifying, efficiently fast predatory spiders completely and suddenly rapidly attack the giant snake. The entirely securely trapped and heavily thrashing giant snake desperately hisses loudly against the completely massive swarm.
The giant spiders completely and violently bite, deeply injecting completely paralyzing venom into the entirely giant snake.
The massive primate cleanly and successfully entirely fights the completely highly terrifying giant underground dark spider swarm.
He thoroughly and completely successfully crushes the giant armored spiders using absolutely incredible raw physical ape strength. The surviving, totally, completely, highly terrified giant spiders perfectly and utterly retreat entirely into the deep darkness. The entirely successful primate deeply and highly safely climbs perfectly up the completely steep underground stone walls. He entirely successfully and completely accurately safely returns perfectly safely back into the bright green natural jungle.
He cleanly and perfectly safely roars entirely loudly, completely successfully asserting his highly total complete physical dominance.